So let me first explain why I'm here. So 6 years ago, I was leading global analytics at Merck, and my brother was faced 4 years into his journey with a rare cancer. We were at brunch one day, and this was the question they asked me. And obviously, when you get that question with a potentially terminal illness, it's a little scary. And not being a doctor, my first thought was, kind of, what the hell can I do? But then I realized I'm sitting on top of massive data. Like coming inside of Merck, they understand pharma, understand data, better than anyone. Maybe there's something I could do. So we quickly sort of went through and looked at all of the data we had for his rare disease, which was not anything Merck was involved in. And sort of within a weekend, we realized we essentially recapitulated his 4-year journey. And it was kind of shocking the number of steps that it took us a long time to find out. Like the surgeon in Louisiana, who was sort of the all-star surgeon, a treatment that is sort of, almost standard of care that took us a couple years to learn about. Another treatment, honestly, in a different country that wasn't that expensive that we actually went and had. So at the time, my goal was, hey, here's something we can do. The reality is it was sort of too late for his situation, but it kind of stood in my brain as, wow, like we probably could have navigated his situation better. A year after he passed away, I was at a conference, and a company had raised a bunch of money, a Silicon Valley company, and they're going to help patients navigate the healthcare system. And it was clear to me they didn't really understand pharmaceutical and healthcare data. And that they were going to sort of guide patients incorrectly. And it kind of I got a little annoyed and upset. So I went to Merck and said, hey, we always talk about saving, improving lives, but we always think about that through medications. We have the opportunity to do it through analytics. They basically said, all right, go figure it out. So we spent 3-4 years working on a platform called MediFind, which is what I now lead, that is helping patients navigate their care. About 1.5 years ago, when I came back and said we figured it out, we kind of realized that Merck couldn't be involved. So we had option 1 was to shut it down, and option 2 was to spin it out. And given how important it was to me, and I think the value we provide, we spun it out. So we literally launched on February 29th, 2020. If anyone understands rare disease, the last day in February is Rare Disease Day. It was a coincidence, I confess, when we when I left Merck and when we turned it on. We weren't really thinking Rare Disease Day, although that was obviously a very important motivator for us. So we feel very proud that our launch day was the rarest of Rare Disease Day, which only comes around once every 4 years. So we've now been in business for a little over a year. Our goal is to help patients navigate their healthcare. We obviously work with pharma as well. I have still a strong relationship with Merck. And I think it's worthwhile, obviously coming from Kristen's presentation, to talk about some of the learnings about the patient journey as we see it now that we're really in it and trying to help patients and all the places that they fall off the ladder and why, and maybe some guidelines as to help when we're thinking about where they really are so we can really help patients. So I'm going to start with what we would like to think about as the sort of hypothetical patient journey. So what we have on the y-axis here is sort of how engaged are you in thinking about your health? Some might call it motivation. It's like how are you really focused on your health? And then this is sort of across time. So the general concept, the simplistic concept, of course, is people aren't really thinking about it much. You're feeling good. I'm not thinking about my health. Yeah, you might be working out. You may be thinking about like well-being, but then all of a sudden you're not feeling good. So you get really focused on what's wrong, and then you're scrambling around trying to figure it out. Then you get diagnosed and it's like, oh my God. So you're really engaged. Then you kind of figure it out and you go to sort of maintenance mode. Obviously for most people, especially coming from behavioral economics, we know this isn't really how it happens. So let's talk about how the typical sort of journey really works. So what you really have is a big cluster of sort of uncertainty up front where you're trying to figure out what's wrong with me. And you have these symptoms, so you go Google around, you're trying to figure them out, and then you feel okay, so you stop, and then you look again, and maybe you have sort of a temporary diagnosis, and then you feel better again, so you're not thinking about it. So you're kind of in these like multiple peak moments where you're very engaged with trying to figure out your problem, but you still can't quite figure it out. We all know getting diagnosed takes, especially for more complicated diseases, it takes way longer than it should. Maybe the #1 problem in healthcare overall. But it's patients are very sort of engaged at that point when they're not feeling good. They get a peak of engagement when they're diagnosed. It's the, oh my God, I've just been diagnosed. They're really engaged. They're trying to figure out what the next steps are. And then what you really see is to the right is a different view. You start out saying, all right, I'm just going to do what my doctor tells me. And then there's peaks of engagement when something's not working. And I'm going to sort of, this framework is going to guide the 5 lessons, but it's really important to realize that there's like people coming in and out of the health system, even after diagnosed. This is a typical patient. Obviously, we know a lot about patients like me of the world, and there's a lot of platforms where there's a small minority of patients who are very engaged and defined by their disease. That's really not the majority of any of patients with any condition. And we're going to explain a little bit who's more engaged and based on sort of different condition dynamics. But there's a lot to learn about how patients engage and when are they engaging, because that's obviously where we want to help them. So first rule, which ideally is already aligned by what we've seen in that slide, patients are actually way more engaged when they're afraid or uncertain. I'm going to give a little bit of information on that. So first, we see on the left, there's a lot more engagement in health when you're trying to get diagnosed. That's sort of the journey. And I'm showing 2 example data points. If we looked at this across 50 therapeutic categories, thousands, we would see similar patterns. So I'm going to start with breast cancer on the right. So there's about 23,000 new patients who get diagnosed with breast cancer every month. About 150,000 of them, I'm going to 7x, are searching for symptoms of breast cancer every month. It's like there's a ton of search for, do I have it? And there's also a ton of sort of search for just the generic term breast cancer. Way more than obviously who get diagnosed a month. So of course, some of those who search for breast cancer could be people who are in one of those peak moments where they're trying to figure it out. But the volume is really high when you compare it to, let's say, HER2 positive breast cancer, where there's only 3,200 new cases. No one's searching for symptoms, and I'm going to explain why for a second. And there's about 6,000 searches for the HER2 positive breast cancer. What you see here, and maybe this is somewhat of a behavioral economics, the people who are afraid, you think of breast cancer. There are conditions that are in your brain that that we all think of that we get scared of. That's where people are searching. I use HER2 positive, but if you take any sort of non-common disease, no one is ever searching for the symptoms of those, or it's such a small percentage, and which is interesting. The real sort of takeaway is that middle line where there's 2x and 10x. So the vast majority of searches for someone who has breast cancer, they're really trying to figure out their diagnosis. It's just a sloppy search, for lack of a better word. So the vast majority are really understanding their intent is a little unclear. But when you compare it to conditions where it's a smaller disease that people don't have in their brain as something to worry about, you see that there's way more generic search. So when we're thinking about advertising and the funnel for getting patients for common well-known conditions, approximately 20% of the traffic is actually diagnosed. The vast majority of that traffic are patients who aren't diagnosed and never will be. So it's really top of the funnel, and from a pharma standpoint, kind of hard to really help them because most of them don't actually have the disease. So it becomes a challenge, and we just also see the fear is a driving motivator, and we'll see that again in a minute. Rule number 2, the vast majority of people don't want to be defined by their disease. I know from a pharma standpoint, we obviously want them to be, and when we get engaged patients, there's nothing better, but most patients don't want to think about it that way. So you kind of look over to the left. We see 2 things, right? There's a standard quote that we've had. I'm sure other people have seen something like it. It's just something I'm going through. It's not who I am. That's a very common sort of quote we'll hear. And the reasons are sort of, some of it's the old style, like they don't be talked about. Like, I remember 30 years ago when anyone had cancer, it was always like, oh, so-and-so has cancer. And it was very sort of scary to talk about, and people didn't really want to be defined that way. Some conditions you're self-conscious about. So there's been a lot of movement to create Facebooks for diseases. You're going to get a small percentage. Most patients want to get in and then get out. If you actually go on a lot of chat boards, one of the challenges you have is someone will ask a question and there'll be no answer for days, weeks, months, depending on the condition. And so that way of getting information ends up being hard today because people want a question and answer to their question at the moment. So what we really see is once you have a disease, and you really just want to ignore it. And that does vary by disease, we'll get there, but you just want to ignore the disease as much as possible. That's how most people think about it. So the implication obviously is, most patients aren't going to engage, we all know this already, in our programs. So that's going to be a small percentage. So to really create blockbuster treatments, we really need to understand that the vast majority of patients are just not going to become acolytes. Are not going to talk about the product as much. They don't really want to. They just want to get it and move on and not think about their health on a day-to-day basis. So one of the things that we have found, honestly, more so than we thought, and this is an area that we focus on, is that patients are more highly engaged in their choice of a specialist than honestly we even thought. That's obviously something that we started out is helping patients find experts for their disease. But the number who engaged in that process is significant. Exactly how they engage was a learning for us. Sometimes they ask for a specialist for their disease. Sometimes they have the disease in mind and they're just looking for a specialist. So we have to sort of put those two together. So there's a couple of sort of statistics here that honestly are surprising me how many. So we see on the first statistic on the left, which is 55% of patients who see specialists are not from referrals. The default pattern for standard conditions is, when you do have a diagnosis, if your primary care doctor sends you to a specialist, you're going to go to that specialist for sort of not overly serious conditions. But then, if you have any complications, you might go to another one. And the number of patients who get second opinions continues to grow pretty rapidly. And this is a spot that patients are arguably in their peak engagement for the majority of patients. There's another peak where they are in treatment choice, but in terms of their engagement, I want to understand what's what my disease is. That's sort of upfront. Then it's all right. Something's not right. I need to find a doctor, and then maybe I really should understand what my treatment choices are. Those are the three main action points that patients go through. And there's a bunch of other things they want to go through as well. But they're the main peak points, and that's where I think pharma has the greatest opportunity to help them and recognize when they're at that moment. That's kind of the journey, point in the journey, and so let's make sure we help them at those moments. And that book is on. If you haven't read that book, it's a great futuristic book from about 5 years ago. So this one's going to get a little complicated, but patient engagement is actually a function of two dimensions, sort of the severity of disease and the complexity of disease. So we've created this grid that we want to walk you through. So on the top, you have what's the severity of disease. So you kind of start with something that's annoying, then you go to serious versus life-threatening. Then you have the complexity going down the side. So is it common? Is it sort of complex, or is it really rare? Exactly where that fits is a good guide to understanding patient engagement. So we'll start at the top left here, and you see that if it's annoying and common, if it's sort of allergies or something very simple, patients may just try to solve with OTC, lifestyle changes. They're trying to avoid sort of the healthcare system as much as possible. Then maybe it gets a little complex. They can't solve it, or the conditions just go on for a number of years. That's sort of, you see that sort of the light tan-ish box. Then they go to essentially the first doctor, and they just do what they're told. If that doesn't work, is where engagement really spikes. So at that point, it's just they can't solve it. It's getting serious. If it's life-threatening or if it's just rare, they become highly engaged. They don't start engaged, they become engaged and get really sort of engaged in it. But the weird thing, and there's a U-shaped behavior, which you see here. I've seen in a bunch of other situations. When it gets really complicated, the patient just gets overwhelmed. And in a large percentage of the population, the caregiver really becomes the person who's really guiding the engagement. And the patient just goes back to, I don't want to think about it. I hope, like it's out of my hands, too complicated. But they know that it's complicated, so the sort of spouse caregiver tends to take over in those situations. So really understanding who we're talking to and who's really sort of guiding that behavior is important for all of us. So I think from a pharma standpoint, it's really where is your brand on that mix, and then who are you really speaking to? So the final point is really every patient wants one simple thing. They just want time. So if you're a patient with a let's God forbid a life terminal illness, you want as much time as possible. If you have a complicated illness, you want to spend less time dealing with it, and you just want to get a solution that works for you. And so every solution that we create on the healthcare pharma side has to just try to minimize time and effort. And I can say we've done, back to sort of Kristen's presentation, we had a lot of learnings about how we present to our patients. So we started out presenting at our home screen. I'll show it on the last slide here. On the left was more Google-like when we started. It was like, hey, what are you looking for? We realized that they need help. Even sometimes they're in a spot in the journey, and it helps them to know what part of the journey that we can guide them to. So on the left-hand side is actually now our homepage, where it's like, all right, hey, I'm not feeling well. I'm trying to get diagnosed. That's where the vast majority of activity actually happens. Then you get diagnosed. You're like, I need to understand my condition. Now you're looking for a doctor. Now I'm looking for a second opinion. Now I'm trying to understand all my treatment options. That's sort of a very common flow as patients get more in depth in their own condition. And so we've really sort of tried to map the true patient flow from how they're thinking about their need in a way that I think matches to that moment at the time. On the right hand side is obviously how we help pharma. There's a lot of ways I won't go through them here, but we take a lot of our learnings both from the consumer side as well as our data analytics side to really help pharma engage with patients. Clinical trials, which the learning I didn't put in, and I'll stop here, is the sixth learning is patients is clinical trial finding is way more inefficient than we realize. We're in the process of even upgrading our own site because patients don't really look for clinical trials; they look for treatments, and clinical trials should be one of their options. And so there's a lot of clinical trial behavior that and possibilities are lost because patients are never told by the doctor, and they don't really think of clinical trials until they're really desperate. So great opportunities there. And with that, I will end and open for conversation for any questions. Seth, you're muted. Oh, and the host.
Yeah, how many times am I going to do that? But so any questions for Patrick, please put them in the Q&A. We'll be able to get there. I'm shocked about, the whole continuum of what you just talked about, because so many people that I know, and, perhaps even myself included in the future, you get a referral or you go to the cardiologist, and more or less the decision's made. It's just some dude or some lady that you go to see, and you have to put all of your trust about your health into that. And you have no idea about skills, qualifications. That's one thing, but also, rapport and fit and how this is going to work out. And especially if it is a complex disease, you're going to need more engagement from your provider than if it's a well visit or like a workup that's been recommended by your PCP. So, this is fantastic. What else can you tell us about, that aspect of it? And the other part of it is too, then nobody ever listens to what they say to do, right? Because it is just some guy or some lady, right?
So I said the default is that's how people start, and in any disease, unless you go right to 0 to 60, where all of a sudden you're crazy, in a serious, just been diagnosed with something really serious. If it's sort of it first seems not too serious, you're just going to follow your primary care doctor and go to the whatever local specialist. But most people, a lot of times, it progresses where it's just a little more complicated, or you just feel like that doctor. You're not you're taking the treatment. You're not convinced they gave you the right guidance. So then you start asking around, like, maybe there's someone better. And the number of people who land there is way more than we realize. And I bet for everyone listening, if you look back at yourself, if you've gone to a specialist, there's probably a 50% chance whenever you went to a second specialist within a year or two because you were sort of dissatisfied or wanted to make sure.
That is, yeah. But then again, that's another search for somebody that's in network and travel and filling out all those forms again, isn't it easier just for me to stick with this guy?
That's the default, absolutely.
And I was a rep for 10 years, and I was in and out of offices, and I sort of saw the interactions between patients and sort of the machine, the engine of spitting, patients out, getting them in, getting out. And, it makes me wonder, like, how much of an actual engagement do they have, and what type of engagement do they have, with their health? So how does pharma get involved with MediFind?
So again, obviously we love to work with pharma. We have a strong relationship with Merck and a couple other pharma companies. So honestly, reach out to me if you have any questions. If anyone wants to understand how user experience works, one of the areas that we're really working with is helping connect pharma brands to experts in their condition. That's one of the challenges that a lot of patients face is, all right, especially if you're in a rare, semi-rare disease, your outcomes, everyone knows your outcomes are way better if you get to an expert quickly. So we're starting to work with pharma brands to help their patients do that. So that's probably the great opportunity, one of the biggest learnings we've had.
Gotcha. Did we just get this question from Laura, I believe? Talking about the term evidence-based versus, and would these behaviors be evidence?
Well, I guess if we're coming from a pharma standpoint, I don't know if it wouldn't be evidence from a legal standpoint, but in this case, I view evidence and data-based decisions as the same. We're looking at the data and using that as evidence to infer what's going on, because as Kristen said, asking is actually much more difficult, and you don't get the answers you expect.
And then what sets you guys apart from any other type of doc finder?
So the reality is, if you look at so it's a great question. Most people, in the world today, in the sort of consumer world, if you think of a doc finder, you're probably going to think of Health Grades as number one. You might think of ZocDoc. If you actually look at they're really focused on primary care doctors. And if you went in and said, I have this sort of tougher disease, let me find an expert, they'll still actually point you to primary care doctors. What we're trying to do is solve the space that they're not solving, and say, all right, patient, you have this sort of more difficult disease, or you're even considering various diseases. Let's make sure you get to an expert. We know that, I didn't say it in this conference, but there's a study by Mayo Clinic that 88% of the people who got a second opinion had a refinement or a change to their diagnosis. Now, I think the refinement is important. There's probably about a third of the people get a changed diagnosis, but when you get to an expert, you get a dramatic. The number of people that we've sent to experts were like, oh, you don't actually have what the first doctor told you had. So the number of treatments that actually were avoided is actually fairly significant when you do sort of find an expert who can confirm that the diagnosis is truly correct.
On the flip side of that, the patient will see you now. We're doing much more research on our particular conditions, and we have to, I am convinced that I have this particular congenital heart disease, so I'm going to skip all the steps of going to PCP, to a regular cardiologist, to even a congenital specialist, and I'm going to go right to University of Pennsylvania and talk to the top congenital heart specialist and go through all those hoops to find out it was indigestion, right? So there's a flip side to that, I guess. There's a flip
side. So we actually view specialists into two categories, to keep it simple. There's the focus specialist who maybe is on 1, 2, 3 diseases, depending. They're usually sort of very related. And there's the generalized specialist. Those generalized specialists, you can actually see where they have a lot of experience. So some doctors are really great at being the Dr. House, where this doctor is great at helping you figure out your diagnosis and then give you over to someone who is an expert in that specific diagnosis. So we've actually added to that, that to our website recently to help sort of patients. Obviously, the number one concern is driving a bunch of hypochondriacs to doctors when they don't need to go. But that's obviously a a possible downfall. And a lot of the top doctors, they actually have a process where they make sure you sort of qualify. So when you want to, if you have something pretty serious, you want to go to a Penn or Stanford or even Mayo, they want to sort of pre-qualify you first because they don't want to take the garden variety. I have something fairly simple. Take up a slot where some patient who has a disease really needs our help.
Gotcha. So what we're going to do is take a short break. We're going to be back at 4:05 with some discussion about user experience with our expert Ryan Rosenberg from Sanofi. Questions for Patrick. He'll be around in the audience. Just shoot him a chat or go double click on any seat near Patrick and you will join that conversation. And we'll see you back here in about 8 minutes.
Thanks, Seth. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.